All right, kia ora. Welcome back, and welcome back for those of you online. It's my pleasure to introduce Julie MacArthur. Um, it's really my pleasure that you got your camera working and all that. Um, so Julie is the Canada Research Chair in Reimagining Capitalism at Royal Roads University in Victoria, British Columbia. Um, She does research in political economy, low carbon transitions, and the role of the social economy and community-led transitions. So prior to moving back to Canada, what was that, 2 years ago now? Something
Three.
like that?
Number three, rounded on
Three,
four.
yeah.
Flying.
Uh, Anyways, prior to moving back to Canada, um, Julie was at the University of Auckland in political science. Where she's done a lot of really important work looking at the opportunities and challenges for indigenous and community-led energy models, looking at inclusivity and doing a lot of comparative work across New Zealand, Canada, and Europe. And I think there's one article in particular that I'm thinking of that comes from Scott's keynote earlier, that really identified some of the issues that might hold back community and indigenous-led energy in New Zealand. You did a review, I don't know, a while ago, but I think a lot of that still holds true and is actually perhaps moving in the wrong direction again. But anyways, it is my great pleasure to introduce Julie. So please join me in welcoming Julie to the OERC.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm so sorry about the tech issues, but I'm sure you guys heard they are used to them and they happen. I'm situated on an island right now in the Pacific, much like you. So I wish I was there with you in the room, but we have that connection at least. And I think we kind of operate on island time here on Vancouver Island where I am. So the university I'm at, Royal Roads University, is on the land of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And I think land acknowledgements are traditional here as they are in Aotearoa, but I think that connection is actually a really powerful, important one here as I'm talking about this shift to more just, more equitable, more inclusive energy transition. So thank you so much, Sean, for the invitation to give this talk. As I said, I'd much rather be there in person. We had a bomb cyclone here in Vancouver Island just the last couple of days with 250,000 people without power. And schools shut, power lines down, all of this kind of exciting climate crisis as we live through it. And I think that's important also for the talk I'm giving, because this isn't really just a nice to have. I think the argument I'm going to make, and many others have, in the context of building inclusive and just transitions, is that this is one of the only ways to make them effective and resilient as things really get challenging. So in BC, shortly after I moved from BC's British Columbia, where I'm located, shortly after I moved back from Auckland, in 2021, we had a heat dome, they call it. There's all sorts of new names for weather patterns, right? The heat dome actually got temperatures in Canada, in Western Canada, up to 50 degrees, burnt down the entire town of Lytton and killed over 600 people. And most of the people who were killed in this heat dome were elderly, were poor, were largely women living in social housing. And every time we're seeing these kind of big waves of crises, we see more directly, and this is to Scott's talk earlier, the really powerful kind of inequity in who pays the cost. And I think if you keep that in mind as I'm giving my talk today about the community energy situation and solutions, I think that's important. So I entitled this talk today, Democratizing Energy Transitions in Aotearoa, from an individualized prosumers to empowered citizens. And I layered it with all this harakeke and flax kind of in the background, because I'm going to talk a bit in the conversation about policies and projects from different countries, from Denmark and the European Union, from the UK, no longer part of the European Union, from Canada, and then also some of the research Sean mentioned on community energy and kind of local action in New Zealand. And the flex is there in particular because it's so important to not uncritically import the international policies and literature on grassroots innovations, as they're called, but really think about it in culturally and landscape and the demographic context of New Zealand itself, which of course has this very strong component and need for Māori sovereignty and energy sovereignty, as well as really unique profile in the power sector. So the last thing I wanted to say on point of introduction was my colleagues and I were all clustered around my computer the other day watching the haka led by Hannah Rafiti Matthew Clark on the Treaty Principles Bill. And that was shared all over the world, and it was really powerful. And I think this is, again, to Scott's presentation earlier, a really important time to think in a more holistic way about what an energy transition needs to look like in terms of land access and land back and power, and the kinds of people and processes that are involved in making those core decisions. So with that long-winded introduction, the broader context, of course, of this look at energy democracy and the shift from individuals to collectives, politically constituted collectives and prosumers, is the idea that we are part of this shift that is being undertaken around the world, involving massive amounts of money, reallocation of funds, creation of new industrial, economic, and political constituencies with it. But the historicization of this study of energy transitions also illustrates to us how new actors are kind of layered on top of very powerful incumbents. So the image on the screen is that 1800 up to 2020, and how much the fossil fuel segment of that is still rising, but also extraordinarily high as a percentage of the total energy sources being used. So the boom in the renewables that gets a lot of the news attention is this tiny slice sitting on top of this very, very dirty kind of subsurface, really. And on top of that, so here's the fuels base of the energy transition. But of course, Peter Newell wrote a really good book called Power Shift, and he says how to transition to a much larger share of renewables or to a zero carbon economy in a timely and fair fashion is one of the greatest challenges the world faces. It requires a power shift away from the beneficiaries of a high carbon economy towards a much more disparate set of actors on the front line of climate change, and those that can gain from a more sustainable economy. The scale of this shift across regions and sectors and actors is without precedent. And so the point is not just a technical transition to new sources using new technologies, but a very a much broader and holistic transition to new actors who don't have the same incentive structures as those that are perpetuating the problem. And they're both instrumental, so getting the job done, and normative, just because it's the right thing to do, reasons to care about this. So a lot of the kind of compounding climate crises that we're seeing and the compounding economic crises that we're seeing are really putting pressure on incumbent systems. And really it opens up this opportunity for reconstituting things at the same time as we're seeing real contestation around the kind of future we want to build. I'm located at Royal Roads University, but also in an institute called the Cascade Institute. And the whole focus of this institute is what's called the polycrisis. So that conjuncture of economic, social, and environmental crises feeding into each other, creating challenges, but also significant opportunities for rewiring and restructuring the system. So there's a lot going on at the same time, but that's that kind of broad, why are we here and why are we doing this? So Greenberg and McKendry, in an article that I often reference, talk about how the nearly century-long reign of depoliticized electric regulations, you know, that technical stuff nobody really cares about unless you're an energy geek, where activities were cordoned off, as they talk about, from the agitating publics. A lot of that's eroding. We're seeing a lot more people get agitated about the cost of things, but also who's running the system. And with the rise of populism more broadly, internationally, we're seeing a lot more pushback, especially if things are framed as a push for net zero. So the quest for a just and low carbon transition is really important. We're starting to see this represented as well in a lot of the international material from the International Energy Agency, climate actors and whatnot. So in their Global Energy Outlook from 2022, the IEA talks about how inclusive, people-centered approaches are essential to allow vulnerable communities to manage the upfront costs and ensure the benefits are felt widely. And even beyond that, there's a lot more research with a focus on grids, and estimated $100 trillion to be invested in energy transitions by 2050. But the grid reinvestment on things like undergrounding and creating microgrids and all of this, the huge volume of money it's going to take to do that work, brings up issues around where the benefits are going to flow, whose backyard everything gets built in, and all the messy kind of politics of infrastructure development more broadly. And in a lot of the reports on this by the IEA and other actors, they're starting to see how grid projects, new transmissions lines and whatnot are really starting to be held up in some very costly ways by communities and groups who don't want that infrastructure in that their backyard. So this is one of the places where we're starting to see higher level actors paying attention to local community actors, at least in theory, right? It's showing up in the reports. There's a nod to this. And in some places, it's starting to be backed up by particular policy attention, which from my view is really important. So the other thing that I'm noticing in a lot of the international and some national level policy regulation is when there's focus on the need for citizens or people or new actors to be involved, it's not defined very well who and how these actors, who these actors should be necessarily, and how they're going to be involved. And from my research, it's absolutely essential for that to start to be developed and spelled out. So what I've noticed, especially when I was doing research in New Zealand, is a lot of the time what was seen as particularly new and revolutionary was a shift from consumers. So people in their homes as passive, you know, I purchase my electricity and it's delivered to me, to prosumers. And this was the extent to which people were seen as new actors in the energy system, right? So you can put panels on your house, or you can have a battery electric vehicle or something like this, but you're involved in the system in that way. And what I wanted to highlight in my talk today is how there's a much more expansive, transformational, and extensive understanding of what new participants and actors could and should look like. So going well beyond individualization, which usually relies heavily on a person's own education levels, resources, time, energy, all of this. Whereas groups of people working together as collectives through organizations that represent their interests is where I'm going to spend a lot more of the time today. But I just want you to be attuned to that as you see policy announcements that talk about involving people in the transition, whether they're talking about people as individual consumers or people as active participants. And the literature on this, I mean, there's a few different literatures. Some of it talks about energy justice, as I'm sure you're hearing at your conference. The framework I generally work within, or broadly work within, is that of energy democracy. So it's thinking about participation by citizens in a more robust way. So it could be being involved in planning processes that public utilities are involved in. It could be political agitation to move privatized assets back under public ownership. And another element of this is the decolonizing element that you see on the screen. So the idea about democratizing into more inclusive and participatory arenas where those traditional actors are replaced by non-traditional actors in terms of race and gender and class, importantly. So this isn't only upwardly mobile professionals, but this is also a much broader subset of the citizenry. A decentralization of technologies, but with that also this focus on decolonizing, which includes things like land back and also energy sovereignty. So not just consultation of indigenous nations or peoples or Māori in the context of Aotearoa, but actual project control and the revenues and benefits flowing back. Now, many of you will know some of this already exists, and so we're moving in that direction. But essentially what we're talking about under that energy democracy is a movement to citizenship. So direct asset ownership, community power. And there's a lot of variations of the kinds of processes that can take place to support that. Within energy democracy is a more specific focus on what's called community energy. Walker and Divine Right have one of the kind of seminal contributions to this, but what I want to highlight here, again, for those of you who are getting or work in this area, is the difference between what they've kind of talked about in terms of outcome and benefits of a project, like who makes the money from it, on one axis, and then also how are the processes around that project developed. So do local actors, do people living proximate to it, do these non-traditional groups actually have a say with control? So there's the benefits dimension and there's control, and that kind of ideal version of community energy sits in that top right, where there are open and participatory processes on the developments of grids and charging infrastructure and development of new sources, as well as a much more even distribution of the benefits that aren't just concentrated to centralized energy utilities or companies. So I have the umbrella here basically because community energy in and of itself is a fairly contested definition in some ways. So those from more engineering backgrounds often talk about energy communities in terms of just anyone connected to the grid in a place. Whereas those from a more policy and politics perspective often focus on particular organizational forms that are democratic in their constitution, like cooperatives, or in their benefits, like the trusts that exist in New Zealand. And another kind of part under the umbrella has to do with the role of local governments as a democratic actor that intersects with these various parts. So in the research that Anna Berka and Claudia Gonnelli and I did that was published in 2020, we kind of illustrated a number of different policy layers that facilitate the development of local ownership. I think at a very base level, having legal frameworks for mutual ownership is absolutely essential. And then layered on top that, we have the need, I think that Scott was talking about as well, from being able, these local actors forming in non-traditional, maybe legal forms that aren't the dominant form of activity in the system to access the market. And then layered on top of that, what we found from a lot of the international literature was those areas where these community energy actors were able to flourish had capacity building and soft policy supports, had demand guarantees, investment incentives. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk to you about what that looked like in some of these other jurisdictions we looked at. And one of the things that comes up a lot in this literature on, again, why do we want or why do we need community energy or energy democracy is that some research in the United States found that they were surveying municipal policymakers or local government policymakers as well as citizens in an area. And they found that there was a disconnect between what the policymakers thought people wanted, not shocking to many of you, but a lot of the time policymakers underestimate citizens' willingness and desire to actually transition to new technologies, right? There's a disconnect and a risk aversion. So there's a principal agent problem going on there. But they also found that when projects were community owned, that it was associated across the board and across political allegiances with increased support. So this wasn't just something that was a right-wing or a left-wing thing, that this actually was something that opens up opportunities, because these kind of community ownership, even though it sounds like it might be more of a left-wing thing, actually lines up with a lot of help your neighbor, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There's a lot of the kind of narratives that span the political spectrum that these organizations can play into. So I'm going to turn now briefly to just like a tiki tour of a few countries and the kind of institutional and policy supports that enabled community energy in those countries. So in Europe, one of the kind of notable policies is the Clean Energy for All Europeans package in 2019. And there were a related number of regulations that came with that. But essentially, the regulation and legislation clarifies that citizen-led initiatives contribute to renewables production and other activities. So it kind of acknowledged the value of these activities, including things like renovations and energy policies. But then one of the EU directives recently came out saying all member countries have to enact laws to make community energy not only possible, but also profitable. So this really upends the idea that you put out policies and whoever can compete, wins the bid, and away they go. This is really acknowledging the distinct contributions and difference of community ownership as a mechanism for the energy transition. Now, a lot of this work to lobby and put forward this argument around difference and benefits and things like that has to do with a group called ResCoop, whose acronym I can't remember the names of, but it's around renewable energy source cooperatives, essentially. And ResCoop and others have found that by 2030, citizen-run energy cooperatives could own 17% of wind in the European Union, 21% of installed solar. So, I mean, these are forecasts based on what has been developing. But there's this mutually supportive relationship going on between the community energy sector in Europe that has been growing in Belgium and Germany and Denmark for many years, forming into these federations, the federations then lobbying at the EU level, which is then developing policies to strengthen. And I'm making it sound much simpler, easier, and less contested than it is, but I only have so much time in this presentation, so I'm happy to talk a bit more about that. But those policies were really quite transformative. And so with that, there are all these predictions about what's possible. And this is not focused on individual prosumers per se. This is based on citizen energy collective formed together in cooperatives or other legal forms that kind of bring people together to do a wide range of energy activities. One German study, for example, out of this massive development in the EU showed that a 7-turbine community wind park of 21 megawatts generated 58 million euros in regional income over a 20-year period, while the same size park with commercial developers only produced 7 million euros. So that's a significant, I think, like 9-fold increase in the local economic development. And the local economic development angle is one that you can see appealing to, again, a much wider range of people across the political spectrum. So where does the money go and who gets the jobs and whose bills are reduced and how much more food can you put on the table? So moving from that broader EU into Denmark, some of you have probably seen me talk about this one before because it lets me put up one of my very favorite pictures. So Denmark was one of the leaders in the development of community energy, but also in wind turbine technology and the kind of overall share that wind contributes to their power system. And part of that had to do with a shift of policies after the OPEC crisis in the 70s, which had them focusing a lot more on energy security and energy sovereignty, but also industrial development. So here's the argument around we need to get ahead in this industry so we can then export that technology and be a world leader in that technology. But one of the ways they did it was through incentivizing community actors, incentivizing local ownership, not again as individuals, but as groups and collectives of farmers. Large power plants were organized as cooperatives with electricity distributors as the owners. And so the IEA back in 2012 said that form of organization without a traditional profit motive driving them offered little resistance to government intervention in the sectors for electricity and heat. This institutional structure, that ownership structure is around whether profit's that central motive or whether it is about service provision more broadly. We see that reshapes that connection between the policymakers as, you know, the gatekeepers versus a partner, let's say, in the organization. And so the Danish policy also made investment income for community projects tax-free. So we see again these kind of layers of policy that help facilitate the development of wind in Denmark in particular, but community energy. So this is the picture I was talking about. So this was right before the pandemic. I had a research and study leave, and I got to go to visit the Middelgrunden project and Copenhagen and the UK, and I was studying the development of community energy. This project is a 40 megawatt offshore wind farm, and when it was developed in 2001, 100,000 families belonged to it. It was the largest offshore wind farm in the world, and this is community owned by the Copenhagen utility and a cooperative. So it was a 50-50 ownership model. The co-op had 10,000 members with investments ranging from 500 euros to 3,000 euros, and 85% were individual residents, but they were working together. So there's tourists that you can go out on a Zodiac boat and see the turbines and learn about it. The Middelgrunden was also really notable, and you'll see it in the news again because the turbines are coming up to the end of their life. And so the question is the co-op going to reinvest now that electricity prices have changed so much in that 20-year period, now that the Danish state has actually reduced a lot of its support for those citizen energy projects. So it's a fascinating story, but also I think really illustrative of the fact that community ownership and the kind of social and political offshoots of that, they don't have to be small projects. And this particular project spawned this huge range of actors looking at this as a model potentially for different places. People travel from all over the world to see this. I'm sure many of you in the room have done so as well. So I want to leave some time for questions, and I'm gonna go, I don't want to rush too much either. So we'll see how we go with the rest of the slides. But basically the United Kingdom, now not in the European Union, boo Brexit, is another kind of hotspot for community energy development around the world. It is still very, I don't want to say Anglosphere, but EU, North America, Australia has a pretty robust kind of sector in this area. We're seeing a lot more development actually in sub-Saharan Africa, where folks are looking to use community energy models to develop infrastructure that didn't exist at all. So this isn't even about taking back the infrastructure, but building grids where there was no electricity access. So this is kind of a burgeoning area of research. But the picture I'm showing here in the United Kingdom is basically Community Energy England, Community Energy Scotland, and Community Energy Wales every year put out a state of the sector report. And they have been building over the past 15, 20 years the capacity to look at what's going on in the country, share it, and again, like Rescoop was doing in Europe, mobilize for policy support in the sector to at least tell the story of how what they're doing in terms of the energy services they provide, but also that crucial element of how different they are to other sorts of energy companies in terms of the local economic multiplier or the social benefits for getting at those actors Scott was mentioning who don't engage with the larger energy utilities, who may have their power shut off, who are engaged in functional crowding, you know, living in one room of their 4-bedroom rental unit because that's the only one they can heat. So what I've seen in the United Kingdom since I've been studying it is an absolute explosion of community energy projects where tens of millions of pounds are going back into pubs and schools and all sorts of different projects around the country. Now, it's a federal kind of structure there. So the policies in Scotland are quite distinct from those in England and those in Wales. But essentially, a lot of the policies ramping this up started in 2014 with the United Kingdom Community Energy Strategy, where this was part of that big society project. There was a creation of the Community Energy Unit in the Department of Energy Climate Change. So here we're saying the policy apparatus really recognize again that A, community energy is a thing, B, we want to at least have some analytic support and knowledge about what's going on and devise some strategies for it. So they created a £10 million urban community energy fund. And a lot of the work that these different policies in the UK did was around de-risking, making these projects and the actors who are trying to develop them bankable when they went to access capital. It made it they kind of created a one-stop shop information resource for community energy. Now, if you go to the State of the Sector report from Community Energy England this year, they talk about how as governments shifted, and this will, I think, be important for those in where you are in New Zealand, as governments shifted from Labour to Conservative, they didn't necessarily notice that every Conservative government was hostile to community energy. Indeed, it wasn't, especially when there were coalition governments and compromises made. But certainly the last 2 years, they found that there hasn't been a lot of support. Now, there was another community energy fund which helped develop projects, but there was also a kind of retraction of a number of other policies that they had. So the sector had to develop the kind of mechanisms internally to weather those political shifts and changes. So a lot more mutual support. Some of the things they were doing are sharing business plans. They have these community energy fortnights around England where different projects will open their doors and they'll do tours around and they'll go live on whatever social media outlet to try to raise awareness of the projects and what they're doing. But they're getting quite innovative in terms of projects that are doing battery storage, grid development, and power generation. So as the sector's matured, we're seeing a lot more kind of activities take place and a lot more attention turned to, okay, what about social housing units? What about the non-professional actors? Because typically, as the research has developed in this area, we're seeing still a concentration, often boards dominated by white men, by upper middle class professionals. And so there's a lot more attention turning to diversity in other ways in these particular projects. So this is, I'm not going to go through all the bits, but their Community Energy UK has their kind of state of the sector. And they talk about the number of volunteers, like thousands of volunteers, £12.5 million contributed to the local economy, 4.5 million in bill savings. And it's really useful, I think, when folks are thinking about this. Obviously, the UK is a much bigger country, totally different context. But thinking about the kinds of benefits that have been quantified in different jurisdictions and the kinds of policies that came in and then were retracted and then came back with some more political support, I think is useful. In Canada, as we take our tiki tour back towards you folks, I've just recently completed a survey of electricity or energy cooperatives. So a very specific subset even of the community energy sector here in Canada. And we found about 231 particular generation projects representing about 200 megawatts of capacity here. These are all structured formally as cooperatives. So what that means is that the membership in them, whether they be the workers or the users or the investors, all has control over who the board is and what the projects do. So they don't always have huge participation in board meetings or AGMs, but that's kind of similar in a lot of other projects. So the cooperative is a potentially democratic form when there's strong participation in it. And I can speak to some of the challenges around that later. But essentially, most projects, vary from 200 kilowatts all the way up to a partnership with a private company for a 102 megawatt wind farm, which isn't included in that overall number for a number of reasons. In Canada, there's no direct federal policy support. All the electricity regulation is at the province level. So here where I am in BC, for example, completely different electricity market than the other provinces beside. And you see this represented in the map. You see how the regulatory framework and the policy framework at that provincial level has a huge concentration in some provinces and almost none in others. And we can talk about that, but essentially, some of the provinces brought forward community energy supportive policy, so feed-in tariffs with extra funding for projects that had more than 50% community ownership or indigenous ownership. In British Columbia, they just recently brought out a policy saying all new generation projects that the central utility, BC Hydro, is going to procure have to have at least 50% First Nations ownership, equity ownership. So the policy regime is really shaping the opportunity structures. Again, unsurprisingly, but it's interesting sometimes when you can visualize this. So turning now to the research that Anna and others and I did in New Zealand. So you can see Scott there. He's on the slide down in the middle at the bottom, popping up behind a solar panel. What we were trying to do is essentially bring a lot of the work that the folks have been doing in other countries and say, what does this sector look like in Aotearoa, New Zealand? So this data, it only went up to about 2020, but I know Anna Berka, my colleague, has just done, I think, an update with a paper that's coming out soon. So I'd encourage folks to get in touch with her, or if you don't have her contact information, me. And what we really found was that the community energy sector really kind of fit into 4 kind of diverse categories. So those that were new environmental organizations like Blue Skin popping up, local authorities trying to build new infrastructure out, Māori-owned energy organizations, and then the kind of consumer trusts that were legacy institutions that were inherited through the restructuring. And it's really a complex map that doesn't fit the kind of international literature on what community energy looks like. It was a real mix of public and community and Māori ownership, which I think provides some real opportunities as well, right? Because the logics and narratives and actors involved in each of these are quite distinct. So where there are challenges for one, you can kind of shift and try to mobilize around the others. So these are just some rough overall graphs. We were trying to understand what actual activities were. So we found more than 180 operational projects, but I'll show you in another slide. A lot were stalled and a lot were maybe just in planning. And that's not actually unique to New Zealand. So in the map I just did of Canada, more than half the projects we found that were cooperatives involved in energy, they'd stalled or sold or been bought out or just couldn't get the thing developed. So there are a lot of headwinds for non-traditional actors, which takes me back to that earlier literature by the International Energy Agency and other actors talking about the importance of this inclusive people-centered transition. But the reality of it is really hard work. And I think we heard that from Scott this morning. Right? I mean, it's a bit of an uphill battle, which is why it's so important to push back against policymakers when they want to be technology agnostic or actor agnostic, because it's not a level playing field, not even close. So there's a lot of generation projects in New Zealand, and we tried to code them based on who was doing that activity. I think we also looked at, as I said, this mix between operational plan, suspended, stalled, and that's going to look very different now because, as I said, this is about 4 years old now, but it just kind of illustrates the challenge around getting things up and running. And a lot of those operational ones were kind of the legacy assets by the power boards, right? And the former consumer trusts and whatnot. We also looked at the kind of diverse range of actors. So who is owning these different power generation, efficiency and whatnot projects. We found one of the big differences a colleague and I published on a few years ago was the difference between how cooperatives just don't really feature in the electricity sector in New Zealand in the way that they really do in a much bigger way, particularly in Europe and Denmark and other countries. So we kind of categorized that. We looked at the different logics and also the issues around participation. And we found that when it comes to gender diversity, you know, at the local community, not, let's say, the actors that we coded as new environmental organizations, there was a lot more gender and ethnic diversity, but not so much the local distribution trusts. Like the local distribution trusts, when we looked at the board composition and a number of other things, we found were less diverse than the big energy companies when it comes to things like gender. So there's some really interesting, I think, contradictions around the potential, the potentially responsive nature of local energy companies, and then things like inclusivity, which is quite different, right? Than just their local constitution. So there's a lot of messiness in there, but I think overall there's some key takeaways, right? One of them is definitely that The share of projects by environmental charities and co-ops engaged in local energy action is really pretty limited in Aotearoa. And a lot of that has to do with a kind of historic policy stance that focuses on cost efficiency as the primary criterion. The negative views of community energy we found in our interviews existed at high levels in all public entities that we interviewed. Right? Like, I don't think anybody was going to go on the record and put names to it, but essentially there was a skepticism that people could actually work together to do much that was useful or efficient, that we really needed to leave it to the incumbent actors and the big boys in the sector, which I think is really problematic, right? But the international experience from other countries really shows that if a critical mass of projects is established, then it's possible to really ratchet that up to lobby policymakers and also work at the grassroots or grassroots to communicate that difference in ways to community members around you that isn't. There's an Anishinaabe woman I was working with the other day, and she was talking about speaking solar. People in her community don't speak solar or necessarily care about solar. They care about warm homes. They care about paying their bills. They care about, you know, those functional things. And so that's where I think there's a real power in this democratization of the sector, right? People using normal language about things that people matter rather than just trying to sell new technology. And I think there's a political upswing in a number of places where there's a lot of disillusionment with authority and power. And I think that that's damaging in many respects. But I also think that it's more important than ever to then focus on connecting with folks around you and talking about the things that matter and weaving that back up into how we can provide that rather than starting with the technology that we need to put in someone else's backyard. So our data from 2020 pointed to a real growing grassroots organizations, like the Community Energy Network was doing fabulous work. So with them, we ran 2 different forums, one in 2018 and one in 2020. And Gareth and the folks there are really working their butt off, but with a shoestring of a budget. And the way to start to kind of scale that up more really has to do with, you know, that hard graft of working at policy change and also working at the community around you to kind of illustrate the kind of benefits that have potentially been seen in other jurisdictions. So I want to end there. So we have a bit of time for questions and whatnot, but really Anna and I were talking about we did a piece in New Zealand sociology. Now, New Zealand has these kind of 3 potential energy futures: a business as usual, an incumbent-led, and an inclusive future energy path. And because of its unique resource base and market design and competition, but also this culture of kind of hands-off governance and letting things sort themselves out, the impetus and appetite for the regulations and policies we'd seen in other jurisdictions just didn't seem to be there yet. And this was in 2020, but from Scott's presentation this morning, I suspect we've actually gone even back from there. So that pushes it back into the business as usual. At the time we wrote that, we kind of categorized it as incumbent-led. But that doesn't mean that the importance of diverse, not just new sector participants, isn't there. And internationally, we are seeing more and more of this pressure to diversify, and the costs of not doing so in terms of equity, but also in terms of effectiveness of getting projects built, are really significant. So I'm going to stop there. And I just wanted to say thank you for listening to me today. I'm so sorry about the delays, but I'm happy to take questions. And if we don't get through all of them, please feel free to email me. Thanks.
Kia ora, Julie, that was excellent. And I think a good reminder, we heard Marcos from ICA and Stephen from Flex Forum yesterday talk about the role of the consumer, but I think it's really important to highlight, as you have done, that we need to think critically about what is meant when people say the consumer and sort of raise our ambition there, I think, is the lesson I took from much of what you talked about. All right, we have questions. Janet?
Kia ora, Julie. It's Janet Stevenson here.
Janet.
Wonderful. Hi. Wonderful presentation, just inspiring, actually. My question was, in across the various community energy projects you've been reviewing across the world, where typically do the community benefits, or how do they flow back to the community, and in what form? Like, is it that people get cheaper power? Is it that people get some kind of I guess, income flow? Is it that investments are made in community projects to support decarbonisation or household efficiency? So I'm kind of interested in what are the range of benefits that flow back to the community, and how do they flow?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for asking that. So it varies completely. One of the things, for example, they had in Denmark was if a wind turbine is going to be put up, there's concentric circles around it, and the folks within the inside circle get a chance to invest, up to X%. And so then they get a revenue stream from that project. They are a part owner of the project, right? Sometimes that's done collectively. So sometimes it's like a check in the mail that comes annually, like a dividend would from any other investment. The key is, of course, from an energy justice perspective, who has an extra $500 to $1,000? We know people who are, shutting their heating off because they can't pay their bills. So it's not terribly inclusive of those folks. What's been done in some jurisdictions, there's a cooperative in Ottawa here in Canada, and they gift memberships to some community members who can't afford to buy them. So then when they build a project, the income streams go back. But one of the things that's happened, and I talked about how the UK has devolved, Scotland has a really robust community energy support system, which includes things like low interest loans, funding to do your pre-development studies, but they didn't give a lot of that funding support to cooperatives, because cooperatives are essentially like, you invest your money if you have it and you get the benefits, but it's more democratically constituted. Theirs went to these community benefit trusts, essentially. And in that model, what happens is a developer or community owners themselves put up the project, and then the money goes into a trust for the benefit of the whole town. And so that money is going into building facilities for updating roads. And it's a little bit more in some ways politically contentious, because then it's a fight in the community to decide where the money goes. As we all know, anyone that lives in community knows that they can be very contentious places. So buddy down the road wants a new pub and someone else wants, bike lanes. And then that becomes an issue. But it really depends on the constitution of the project and the policies that support it. So in some jurisdictions like Scotland, they've really said that a community project isn't just one that's owned by some people in the community. Like, you can have community projects with 5 farmers invested together. That's a community project. Well, what about everybody else there? Right? And so it really depends on the politics of the place you're in, how you might want to structure that to develop the projects. But yeah, the financial flows look different. In some projects, especially on social housing, the model has been a bill reduction. So when you develop the project, then the beneficiaries are those in the social housing. And there's also, last thing I'll say, in some jurisdictions, the central utility has done a system where people can pay for a new solar system on their home or on their collective group of units through their power bills over like a 20-year period. And this gets around one of those issues where who's going to have $20,000 or $30,000 in their pocket? Hey, it's going to be, people with a lot of money already. If they own a house in New Zealand, probably have a bunch of money already, right? So yeah, there's a really wide variation, which is important then to understand that variation and tailor what your aims are to that model.
Yeah, Gareth.
Kia ora, Julie. Gareth here from CEN.
I so wish I was there. This is brutal.
Yeah. And I can confirm the butt is still on, so that's a bit of a bugger. My question is around, of all of those international examples you've got there, have any of those sectors, community energy sectors, grown to a self-sustaining level from a financial point of view, the support point of view, without strong central government or large federal government support. And when I talk about support, it's like I'm interested in the taxes, tax-free stuff and the policy stuff, but also just direct funding.
Yeah, no, the answer is no, but the more cheering side of it is maybe that it doesn't necessarily have to be consistent, right? There's almost, so the policies came in, so you mobilize, you get some test projects, those test projects have particular results, you make that argument to policymakers, you get a window of policy support, which helps you then roll it out even further. Some of the other strategies are really tight kind of collaboration between, let's say it's labor unions or other industrial partners, and kind of building that. So it's almost like a ratcheting up effect. And sometimes there's a bunch of steps back. But in every jurisdiction that I've studied, I mean, at Canada, it's not the federal level, it's the provincial level, but where these are really taking off, they've had policy support, but almost nowhere has it been consistent. So it's almost like everywhere has had this period of consolidation and trying to go laterally, or sometimes even internationally, to find extra support. But the other thing that folks have done, I think, which has happened a bit in New Zealand as well, is even though we're talking about energy transformations, there's a lot more money and support in ancillary areas like health or whatnot. And so I think that's another strategy that has been used, right? If the energy department isn't developing supportive policies, what about some of the co-benefits? Or there's some new language people are starting to invent around this, right? Like multi-solving and stuff like that, where you can connect in with other agencies of the government and kind of get funding and support for projects, not because of the energy activity you're doing, but because of the co-benefits that are flowing from it. But yeah, I wish I had a different answer, but no, that strong policy support, unless you find some like super, super rich, I want to say dude, because they're almost all dudes, right? As they're building their bunker, maybe that's a place to draw some money. But seems like Elon Musk can probably fund the development of community energy should he want, but we shouldn't count on him.
All right, I think we've got time for one more, so we'll go online.
So this is a question from Alex McMillan, University of Otago. So first of all, great talk, thank you. But you talked about land back in terms of indigenous rights and sovereignty, and she just wanted to know, how does that specifically come in to the community energy space?
Yeah, that's excellent. I didn't get a lot of chance actually to talk about that, but here in Canada, again, it's different every province, but there was this kind of essentially through the process of colonization, as I'm sure everyone there knows, like much of the land was just stolen. In the area that I live on, much of the territory is unceded and treaties were never signed. And so land back comes in insofar as a lot of the, especially rural and remote indigenous nations around here, have poor access, not only to electricity, but certainly the cleaner. Like Haida Gwaii up the coast is still on diesel mostly, and that's incredibly expensive and incredibly, but they're not connected by any transmission lines. So the way that land back comes in is your ability to actually control when projects come onto your land, not as a consulted actor, as in, hey, what do you think of this? And then ignoring you completely, but in being the landholder, which of course has a lot of the economic value as well as the spiritual value. And so a lot of the nations in British Columbia here where I am are advocating not only to have that recognized, and that has largely been, I want to say largely been addressed, but of course there's ongoing fights all the time. But the bigger part of it is to create their own utilities. So the utilities regulator essentially hasn't allowed that. And there's a really fraught history between the central public utility and a lot of nations. So that's where I see that coming back in, right? Is that indigenous sovereignty focus on, and this is why the broader Eurocentric community energy literature doesn't really account for some of that, right? Thinking about indigenous ownership as another nation that is developing its resources separately from, with complete control, rather than, subject to all the same rules and regulations as any other investor. So that's a big part of the debate here, right? Is the creation of indigenous energy utilities so they don't have to deal with the larger regulator. It looks different across the country, but that's a big part of it. Once you have that land control, you have so much more power to negotiate with anyone wanting to develop something or develop it yourself.
Well, I think we're out of time, so if you could all join me in thanking Julie for a fantastic presentation.